Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into a story from medical history that's both fascinating and, frankly, terrifying. It's about a celebrated cure that eventually became seen as a crime, a cautionary tale that forever changed how we think about medicine, ethics, and even what it means to be a person.
This quote, it just perfectly captures the heart of the crisis we're about to explore. It really gets to the central question of the whole story. When does a so-called treatment stop being a cure and start becoming a form of destruction? This is the story of the lobotomy.
So to really understand how a procedure this brutal was ever accepted, let alone celebrated, we have to wind the clock back. We need to look at the world that gave birth to it, a world filled with desperation, a world that was looking for any answer it could find.
Okay, so picture this. It's the early 20th century and psychiatry is facing a huge problem. You have these state asylums and they are just packed to the rafters with patients. And the doctors, well, they had hardly any effective treatments. The pressure to find any kind of solution was just enormous, and that created the perfect storm for a radical and incredibly dangerous idea to take root.
So how did the medical community answer this desperation? Well, a new procedure came along and it promised a miracle. But the tool for this so-called miracle wasn't some sophisticated new medicine, it was a lot closer to a hammer and a metal pick. It all started back in 1935 with a Portuguese neurologist, a guy named António Egas Moniz. He came up with a procedure he called a leucotomy. His theory was that by severing some connections in the brain's frontal lobes, he could essentially break the circuits that were causing mental illness. On paper, it sounded very scientific, very precise.
And get this. This wasn't some fringe idea being practiced in the shadows, not at all. In 1949, Moniz won the Nobel Prize for it. The Nobel Prize! I mean, that's the ultimate stamp of approval from the scientific establishment. It sent a booming message to the world. Lobotomy isn't quackery, it's progress.
But the procedure really took off and got way more extreme in the hands of an American doctor named Walter Freeman. He took Moniz's surgery and, streamlined it. He made it for the masses. He developed the transorbital lobotomy, which was so simple he could do it right in his office, or even travel from hospital to hospital in his van, which he actually called the lobotomobile.
The method itself is just chillingly simple. An instrument, which was basically a reinforced ice pick, was hammered through the thin bone of the eye socket straight into the brain. It's that horrifying simplicity that allowed tens of thousands of these procedures to be done.
At the time, this was being sold as a massive success. But what did that success actually mean for the patients? This is where the story gets really dark.
You see, the gap between what was promised and what actually happened was just devastating. The claim was that patients became calmer. The reality was that they became emotionally numb, apathetic. They were easier to manage, sure, but that was because they'd lost their initiative and their judgment. What doctors were calling a cure was really a total collapse of that person's personality. It wasn't a therapeutic success, it was just convenient for the institutions.
The human cost was just staggering, and it even reached into one of America's most famous families. Rosemary Kennedy, who was President John F. Kennedy's sister, had a lobotomy when she was just 23 for what they called mood swings. It left her permanently disabled with the mental capacity of a toddler for the rest of her life.
And Rosemary's case, it wasn't a rare exception. When you actually look at the data, the picture is just grim. About 70% of patients were left with severe problems. Only a small fraction were considered improved, and that was mostly because they'd become passive. And about 5% of people, they didn't even survive it. These devastating outcomes, they were the rule, not the exception.
So this all brings us to a really uncomfortable question. If the results were so consistently awful, why on earth did the lobotomy stick around for decades? How did such a massive failure succeed?
Well, the timeline is pretty revealing. It's invented, it gets legitimized by a Nobel Prize, and it hits its peak in the early 50s. But look at what stopped it. It wasn't a big moral outcry. It was new technology. The lobotomy only started to decline when the first real antipsychotic drugs came onto the scene.
So why did it last so long? It wasn't just one thing. It was that perfect storm I mentioned. Doctors had almost unchecked authority. The standards for evidence were shockingly weak. You had these overcrowded institutions that cared more about control than about actual care. And maybe most importantly, the patients themselves, who were often poor, locked away, and disproportionately women, they had no voice and no power to say no.
And that brings us to the final and maybe most important part of the story, its legacy. Because the story of the lobotomy doesn't just end in horror. In a strange twist, this colossal failure is a huge reason why medicine is much, much safer for all of us today.
Literally, the entire ethical structure of modern medicine was built on the rubble of this tragedy. Things like informed consent, independent review boards, patient rights, requiring rigorous clinical trials, all these safeguards that we kind of take for granted now were created to make sure a catastrophe like the lobotomy could never happen again.
So, in a way, the memory of the lobotomy acts as a guardrail for medicine. It's the ultimate what not to do. Anytime a radical new treatment comes along, the question is always lurking in the back of everyone's mind. Could this be another lobotomy? It forces us to demand evidence, not just trust authority.
The ultimate lesson here is a pretty sobering one. The doctors who performed lobotomies, they weren't evil villains in a movie. Many of them really thought they were helping people. And that's the real danger, right? It's not malice. It's the unshakable, unexamined certainty that you are doing the right thing, a certainty that's totally disconnected from the evidence and from the humanity of your patients.
And that leaves us with this final question. It's one that's just as relevant today, in our own age of incredible medical and technological breakthroughs. In our constant search for solutions, how do we stay vigilant? How do we make sure that what we call a cure is really about restoring a person, and not just about controlling a problem? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.